Good morning, good afternoon,
Hey, Marty.
and good
How you
evening
doing? Good
around
evening.
this increasingly threatened and terrifying world of ours. We have again another guest of vast experience and eminence, an old and very dear friend of mine, going back more decades than I am even capable of remembering. We have on and one of the wisest, most consistent commentators and critics on the development and evolution of US foreign policy, uh, and how our strategic overextension has led us into one nightmare and bungle and disaster after another around the world, to again throw light on the current dilemmas that we in the United States and you in Europe and the rest of the world now face. I can think again of no better guide than my old friend, the director of the Institute for on Peace and Liberty at the Independent Institute in Washington, Ivan Eland. Ivan, welcome on board. Our situations right now vis-a-vis Ukraine and Russia and vis-a-vis Iran.
Right. Yeah. You want me to just go over each one then and turn?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, the Ukraine-Russia war, the Western media is saying that Ukraine has great gains, and they have been having longer range attacks into Moscow and other places. And the Russian economy has always been under stress from the war. But of course, Russia is a bigger country, and it's hoping to outlast Ukraine in the war. So war is very unpredictable, and sometimes the advantage flows to one side, sometimes the advantage flows to the other side. So it's very difficult to see. But what we do know is that this has been a catastrophic war for everybody. The casualties are immense compared to all the other wars, really, around even Gaza. Really one-sided in that case, but the casualties were more on one side than of course, Israel's. But in Ukraine, Russia, I think Russia's suffered more casualties, but Ukraine has suffered a lot of casualties as well. So it's just a meat grinder. And I think, warfare has changed. The Ukrainian war has really changed military technology. We have a lot of tanks sitting around and, hulks, steaming hulks. And, the drones are a new item. And I think both sides have made innovations in their drone capability. So, and I think the U.S. incidentally is behind in that. I have a personal story on that I can tell you about. But your question is with these wars. The second war is the Iran war, which has turned out to be a disaster for the U.S. Tactically, the U.S. has won, of course, struck a lot of targets, but strategically, and that's what wins wars, is the Iranians are in control of the Strait of Hormuz, which they weren't before the war started, although it's buried apparently underground, deeply underground, which is where they put it. But the Strait of Hormuz, of course, it turns out to be the strategic point in this, and anyone could have told Trump before doing what he did that he shouldn't do it, because that's the first thing the Iranians would probably try to close down. And so now yesterday and today, we see the ceasefire sort of evaporating, which it was pretty clear that was eventually going to happen. So we'll have to see. Trump also said that we may see the strikes go down again tomorrow. So I think he's probably still hopeful that we can have some hot peace, but that's what we have now. And certainly, fuel prices are going up again, and they will continue to stay high as long as there's any sort of doubt on the part of commercial ships or their companies or marine insurers that there's a danger in going through that. So that both wars are still hot, and they don't really serve anybody's interests. So they should probably both sides in each war should probably look for a way out.
Um, what? Who's at fault for the end of this ceasefire? If morality plays a role at all, I mean, have the Iranians feel that they've got a stronger hand and they toughening it out, or is it the Americans who are breaking this ceasefire, as it were, and who are putting pressure on the Iranians?
Well, it's always difficult too, since I'm down on the ground or in the water there. The United States is saying that the Iranians attacked 3 oil tankers, and this is just a response to that. But of course, they have their own view of that, and there's still military forces, and when you have forces in close proximity, there may be violations. Ceasefires are almost never completely. And I think the U.S., if Trump was smart, he gets mad. Trump would be smart if he just ignored a little bit of that and tried to get a settlement. I'm afraid, from the United States perspective, he's going to have to take a face-saving deal. And I thought that's kind of what he was doing, but of course, he's always so unpredictable that you don't know. He gets mad at them attacking these tankers, and then if the U.S. story is correct, then he retaliates, which he didn't really have to do, and that makes things worse. So I think he should really cut his losses and call it a day.
Yeah, Martin.
No, I mean, I agree with your assessment entirely, Ivan. But do you see any ways, even at this late state, that the United States leadership and the leadership of the Western European nations can go on the off ramp to diffuse tensions with Russia?
Yeah, I think there could be some.
Go on.
I think it was wrong for Trump to get back into it. I think he had distanced himself from being the sole supporter, well, not the sole supporter, but the major weapons supporter of Ukraine. And I think that was a good idea because I don't think the U.S. has a strategic need to be in that war. Certainly, Ukraine has, it can't fight on its own, I don't think, but it's certainly been innovative in what they've done. But I think the Europeans are the main backers, and they have more leverage than they used to, and the U.S. has less leverage. I think the U.S. is still providing intelligence to Ukraine in the back door, through the back door. But Trump had a reasonable policy in that regard. I think the United States should not be involved in that. It's not as strategic to the United States as it is to Europe. And I think Europe and Russia should both try to get onto the off ramp to this, because it's not. I just don't see anybody making a real breakthrough in this war.
I agree.
It's sort of in stasis like the other war in the Persian Gulf, is that there's just a lot of casualties. People are dying at a tremendous rate, and I don't know if either country can sustain that type of casualties in the long term. I think, and Russia, the bank sanctions, they may do bank sanctions, and the Europeans are tightening up sanctions, but I think if they could reach some agreement, I would even leave Trump out of the whole mess, because he's just a volatile factor. I think it should be the Europeans, the Russians, and the Ukrainians that try to work this thing out.
But the Europeans are so hopeless. I mean, our leaders, we hate our leaders because they're not, at least Trump is talking to his adversary and the Europeans aren't, The Europeans are still trying to win this war on Ukrainian casualties, In
this war, Trump can't decide which side he's on. He was on the United States was on the Ukrainian side, and then he sort of Trump moved to nudge the Ukrainians to make peace. We don't really know what he'll do, and but I think it would probably be the Ukrainians and the Europeans versus Russia at the peace talks. Now, maybe the U.S. can moderate or something, but I mean, Trump is incapable of keeping his hands off anything. The U.S. assigned a neutral moderator, not Witkoff or Jared Kushner, but a seasoned diplomat to mediate between the two sides. That might be a constructive way they could work. But I mean, I don't see how Trump is not going to try to meddle in there because he wants a peace prize and all that sort of thing. So I think he probably should just be kept out of it. I think he did make a good move in reducing support for Ukraine because, as I said, from a U.S. standpoint, I mean, we lived with Ukraine inside the Soviet Union, and that wasn't a strategic threat to the U.S. So I'm not sure, even if Russia took over Ukraine, their army would be so spent. And I think the Russian army is already spent, and it hasn't been able to take over Ukraine. So I think Russia is in a weak position militarily after this. And I'm not sure Ukraine is going to be a spent country as well. Yeah. So the war is really dragging both countries. And I think after the war, the U.S. should try to improve relations with Russia because certainly the Russian and the Chinese, if you're a realist, have formed this, I won't say it's a permanent bond, but they're much closer than they were before the war. And I think the U.S. should definitely improve relations with Russia after the war is settled.
I was just going to say, but I mean, I take issue with you. I don't know. It's a closely guarded secret casualty rates, but I wouldn't necessarily regard the Western claims as accurate. I mean, everyone lies, right, in wars. And even if the Russians are losing more men, they'd have to lose 6 times more because they've got 5 or 6 times the population of Ukraine for it not to be worthwhile for them as a war because they're treating the Ukrainians. And it's not the Russians who are bussing people in. And I mean, if there were, we'd see videos. It's the Ukrainians who are press ganging. There was a demonstration in Lvov earlier this week. First demonstration, apparently, in Ukraine, one of the most political demonstrations, because of rejection of these press gangs, which are effectively as a death sentence for Ukrainian soldiers. And then they're refusing to take in bodies when the body, I mean, when the Russians deep freeze these Ukrainian bodies and they want to hand them over, and the Ukrainians don't want these bodies because they know they'll have to pay enormous sums of compensation. So that could be a motive why they're saying that not as many killed. Whenever there's a prisoner exchange, there's 50 Ukrainians to 1 Russian. So that kind of doesn't quite go with this idea that the Russians are dying in 6 times greater numbers, you know? So
I think you're right. I think we shouldn't. I think in the West we have largely made Ukraine out to be Ukraine is far from perfect. I've been there a couple of times myself, and it was always a very corrupt place. And I think that's why, because this is a sort of false impression. I think Ukraine is a flawed democracy at that, and certainly they haven't had any elections, but again, there's a war on. So, and that you're right, the casualties, you can never believe either side in the war about the casualties, but all we know for sure is there's a lot of them. Yeah. And both sides, I think, would be much better off if anybody's going to win this war. And we can say, I think now is the time which we should say, let's drop the blame and let's get some talks going that can actually end the war. Because I think both countries are going to be there at the end of the day, and they're going to have to live next to each other. And, there's got to be a real permanent settlement. We can't have something like the Iran war where you have a ceasefire that's not even really, they promised to negotiate an end to the war. That's not going to happen. We have to have an ironclad agreement between the two sides and some security guarantees. I think by the Europeans or the Ukrainians, if the Ukrainians can get them to do that. If I were the Europeans, I wouldn't. But I think that's what Ukraine wants, whether they'll get it or not. And they probably would even want it from the United States. But of course, that wouldn't happen under the Trump administration, I don't believe.
Well, it's depressing because we in Europe are putting our faith in Trump administration. It's like a black box of hope for us. And you seem to be putting your faith in the Europeans. I have no faith, no hope for our European leadership. We're run by an Estonian young woman who has no life. She was a part of the Soviet apparatchiks, Kaya Kallas. I don't know if you know. She didn't know that the Russians had fought on the Allied side on World War II and actually won the war, basically. And she's a total ignoramus, and she's totally drenched in Russophobia. What's happened is that our foreign policy is run by these new member states who are often quite poor and totally steeped in nationalism, and we're kind of dragged into it, apart from the British, who are classically Russophobic to some extent. But lots of countries like Spain and Austria, France, don't want to have anything to do with this stupid war. So it's like the East Europeans got a sledgehammer, finally got the sledgehammer and get to pay all their, it's a massive revenge game for them because they've been under the Soviet jackboot for decades. They have an inferiority complex towards the West Europeans. They're Slavs, they're not quite European. And so they're like hating on the Russians because the Russians are like even less West European than they are. So I think it's a deep psychological thing as well. And they're running our foreign policy, basically. And if you look at the top 5 security positions in the European Union, it's all run by Estonians and Latvians and Lithuanians, pygmy countries with no GDP and no industry. How did that happen? None of us voted for
it happened because NATO expanded and let them in. So now they're.
But it's like Tammany Hall, except on the European scale. They have no capacity except hatred.
I was against the NATO expansion of Poland, Hungary, and
right.
Czechoslovakia, Czech Republic, when they did it. That was the first round. But I've been even more against it as it crept east. And of course, you're right. How can NATO defend Baltics? Everyone always asks that question. Nobody ever provided a very good answer for it because they're so far forward. If Russia attacked them, it would be, you'd have to take aircraft carriers into the Baltic, which I don't think.
Exactly.
I don't think that's going to happen. So it's a real problem. And we just got, the United States just got drunk with its sole superpower status. And they just kept saying, well, we want to get it while the getting's good, and Russia's down, and so we're going to move the alliance right up to the borders. At some point, Russia's going to come back. Russia's a great country in the sense that it's been around for centuries, and it's always been a great power. And they need a sphere of influence as we have in the entire Western Hemisphere. To get people to put themselves in Russia's position at the time. And that was a real problem because they just kept gobbling up countries and saying, well, we'll defend you. You're on our side now. You're flipping sides. And that's how we got to this place. And now, of course, as you point out, some of those countries on the eastern flank of the alliance, they're screaming, saying, look, Russia, and Ukraine are in this war, and they're going to come after us next. But I think it's preposterous because Russia has more, and I don't think that's going to happen at all, really.
Well, I'll just say, Martin, I don't know if you want to say something. I was in the Baltics in the early 1990s, and I saw the departure of the Russians personally.
You talk about Ukraine as surviving this war, Ivan. It seems to me the balance in Europe has already been upset. Ukraine has been destroyed, and it's been destroyed by NATO generals, NATO policies, most of all by Boris Johnson, who correct me if you disagree with this, but it seems to me the best chance for averting this catastrophe was the Istanbul agreement that the Ukrainians at the time were even willing to enter into at the end of 2021, the beginning of 2022. And it was then British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, the same worthless demagogue, who triggered the other catastrophe Britain has been reeling from ever since, and that is the vote for Brexit, which he came out in favour of way back in 2015. Since then, what have we seen? We've seen at least 1 million Ukrainian boys killed. The death toll could be as high as 2 million. The number of casualties is much higher than that. Estimates that I have seen are that Ukraine's population, which was well over 40 million 20 years ago, as I remember the country, is now down to 22 million at the most, possibly less. 3 million fled to Russia, significantly enough. They would have, of course, been Russian speakers from the east. Another 8 million have fled to the west since then and have tried to rebuild their lives very understandably. Many, if any of them, will dare to risk ever going back. And therefore, you have a net loss of between 12 to 13 or 14 million people. And it was already a poor country, as you've pointed out, and it had very, very poor indexes of development. Before then, even the agricultural wealth which Ukraine is famous for is likely going to be heavily depleted by the costs of the war, even if the war does not go nuclear. But again, in terms of reconstruction, what would you recommend, Ivan? Are there realistic paths for Ukraine to recover with both internal policies and aid from the outside world? Or is it simply too far gone for even that to turn things around now?
Well, I think after any war, no matter how bad it is, if you have the right policies, humans seem to adapt to their environment. So I think Ukraine can recover. Now, the problem, I think, one of the problems is they've both Bush, George W. Bush, and Biden. The war was triggered in the first place. NATO, and I think that was a no-go for the Russians. And I think most of what Russia has done inside Ukraine was done to prevent that, because they just don't want to see that. Ukraine, both culturally, historically, and economically, has always been sort of tied to Russia. And that was just a bridge too far after the Baltics went into NATO, and the NATO crept up to Poland and that sort of thing. So I did this idea that they always held out that Ukraine would be admitted into NATO has been really bad for Ukraine, because I think when you have an alliance, and it usually happens when countries are in the alliance, the small countries, they become more aggressive towards the opposing big power because they know they have big brother standing behind them. In this case, I think, to NATO was sort of dangled over before Ukraine, and I think that's been a problem for the Ukrainians on many fronts. And I think Ukraine could recover if they have the right set of policies to do so. I'm not the one obstacle in that is the corruption level there. And I think war usually breeds more corruption. And I wasn't there after the war started. I was there before that. It was corrupt then. So I'm sure that, and they have demonstrated significant corruption, I think, in the Ukrainian government during the war. So that could be one big obstacle that is in the way of recovering for the Ukrainians.
Ivan, if we look back at previous American wars and Reconstruction afterwards, Korea eventually made a very striking. Of course, the international conditions were extremely different than they are now. Vietnam became and was cut off from the West for decades afterwards. Again, though, in both cases, what was crucial was extremely long periods of recuperation and recovery, really for entirely new generations to emerge. Is it feasible that Ukraine will even be granted that mercy, at least?
Well, Vietnam is an example of a communist country which has reformed itself to at least a little bit of an extent. And I think they've to the extent that they've prospered, that's the reason why. And I think if Ukraine, it was a communist country during the Soviet Union, but they moved past that into the corruption stage. If they could get rid of the corruption, they might have a chance to, South Korea, but they would certainly be doing better than they're doing now. And of course, the war, you're right, the war is just devastating to Ukrainian society. And they would really, I think, smart, and it would really hurt them to settle that and let the Crimean Peninsula go for forever, and the eastern part of Ukraine, which is mainly people and Russian speakers, that should probably go too. And I think if they accepted that, I'm sure they don't want to do that after all the blood they've spilled.
That's the trouble. It's spent.
It's some sort of, boundaries that corresponded to the ethnic affinities of the population living there. So that's where we run into problems.
Yes.
When there's more than 10% of the population is of the other ethnic persuasion, usually start having problems. And then when it goes up from that,
Precisely.
then you have a problem. And I don't think the national borders there follow the ethnic affinities of the population, and didn't before the war. So, they might be a stronger country if they just consolidated a little bit, ruled the people that had an affinity for their cause. I don't know, maybe some of the affinities have changed during the war, but that would have to be sorted out. But I always thought they should have a, legitimate referenda about what people living in places which country they wanted to be in. That would be the logical way to do it. But I know the elites of countries don't usually follow that prescription when they divide people
No, they don't.
We had the Indian-Pakistan problem where the Indian or the British guy who was supposed to, draw the demarcation line never even went out to the border between the two countries to see what the story was. Well, what's going on, right? And so, of course, we got there. And so I think, if you put it to a referendum and we split up it could be an independent country. They could carve off an independent country. They could have, it could go, and there could be a variety of settlements, but I think it should correspond to what the people there, state and people have sovereignty as to what they want to do. And the government would just hire the people to run the government for the people. And if you go by that idealistic framework, that's probably what should happen there too. But I'm not sure it will. But I think we've got to get some peace agreement that's stable and up in another 10, 20 years.
I think they should have done as Czechoslovakia, the Velvet Divorce. The Czechs and Slovaks spoke almost the same language, but they were not happy in each other's company, and they should have had a referendum in both parts before opinions became so polarized. I mean, Ukraine was never a unitary state, it was a construction by the Soviets, partly because the Bolsheviks wanted a number of Russians to screw things up for the Ukrainians. In other words, they wanted that national objection because they didn't want the Ukrainians to break free. But Ukraine, conversely, didn't really deserve those Eastern Russian parts because they'd never been part of a polity with that part. It had never been independent except for 2 years or something during the German rule in 1917 to 1919. So, but people don't want to talk about that,
Well, I think that's a real problem in Ukraine because you have certainly ethnic oppression of one population over the other, as you have with many countries around the world. And if you delineate the boundaries at least reasonably close, and if you have voluntary population transfers, they can't be, forced, that's ethnic cleansing. But if you say, listen, all your countrymen are going, you're over here, and all your countrymen are going with the other side. Do you want to stay here? Do you want to go? So if they stay, then they're coming to not go. But I think they should try to make the boundary go along ethnic lines, and if it has to zig and zag a little, don't make it a river or some mountain range or something like that's inviolable. You have to, carves with the ethnic population,
Yeah.
zigs and zags with the ethnic population.
Martin?
I fully agree with Ivan's process coming about for the very reasons you yourself have pointed out, Ivan, and wanting to end war and bring peace. We grasp at any hope we can, but very often the hopes we grasp at, there's nothing better, but those hopes themselves are all too frail. I see that here. I predicted the breakup of Czechoslovakia well in advance, and back in 1980, about it at the time or shortly thereafter, ancient times then, who had this strange gift for seeing far beyond what any sane person could or should have seen. He predicted the upsurge of Ukrainian nationalism and of Baltic nationalisms too, and whatsoever, as you seriously in Washington. Yet within 5 years, the Soviet Union had disintegrated. But there was this terrible 20th century history of Ukraine, of an empire, and also fighting equally bravely in large numbers for the Austrian Habsburg Empire in World War I. Then you had the slaughter on both sides during the Russian Civil War. The Red Terror and the White Terror both swept Ukraine, huge bloodbaths. Of course, you had the Holodomor, the famine genocide, which remains central to the Ukrainian people to this day. And even a Russian figure as eminent and moral as Alexander Solzhenitsyn refused to call it a genocide. He recognized 10 million people had starved to death in Ukraine, but his attitude was the Ukrainian people were not being singled out. Communists did this to the Russians as well, which was also true. But the fact is 10 million Ukrainians died at the hands of the communists from 1929 to 1932, the most monstrous circumstances. And then you had Ukrainians fighting on both sides, overwhelmingly actually on the Soviet side against the Nazis, but very significant numbers with the Nazis as well in World War II. So my attitude towards Ukraine was always the same attitude I had towards modern history is so filled with bloodstains and horror and massacres and genocides, and the country is so new on the world scene. Thank you, Woodrow Wilson, for your infernal legacy yet again. And the borders are so uneasy that when you have an uneasy equilibrium, as you did in Ukraine, as you have noted, Ivan, from 1989 for the next quarter century to 2014, the best thing to do is to leave it alone and let people settle down and find their own equilibrium. But Ukraine has, like Iraq, has too much natural resources and is in too strategic a situation. So in both cases, the poor populations were never left alone. But, in words of the old, what we are trying to do here, it seems to me, and we have to because there's no other alternative, but Humpty Dumpty sat on the wall, Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. The egg that was Humpty Dumpty, the egg that was Ukraine, is broken and shattered into pieces, and we are desperately looking for ways to put it together again with glue. And I really fear it's impossible to do so. If we fail, what comes next? As you said, Ivan, another war every 10 or 20 years? More likely every 5 years?
Yeah, Ivan, can you... We've got 1 minute left or 1.5 minutes left. How would you conclude? I mean, the Humpty Dumpty metaphor, how can you put Humpty together again?
That's plenty for you, Ivan.
Well, you know, that's not my role, really. I mean, I would say that that you have to get a peace, as I mentioned, you have to have some referendum in these border areas, what's now the front line, and see what people want to do. And then you have to adjust the borders. And I think that's the only way for Ukraine to ever, it has to be probably a smaller Ukraine, and the Ukrainian government's not going to like that. But, there's no there used to be among economists saying, you have to have a sizable economy or you can't become prosperous. But let's look at Luxembourg, Liechtenstein, some of these countries that are very small. So you can have a smaller Ukraine, and that still won't be anywhere near the size of Liechtenstein and Luxembourg. And if you have the right policies, and if you trade with other countries, and if you have innovation, and if you have a free market system,
yeah, and we got to wind up there, Ivan and Martin. And geographically, it'll be the largest country in Europe still, or second largest, even if the Donbass gets lopped off, and one of the larger countries still be bigger than Romania, and probably more easy to swallow for the Europeans. I don't understand why we don't solidify this division. I mean, it's good for everyone, really. Good fences make good neighbors. Anyway, we've got to wind up there, gentlemen. Thank you so much, Ivan, Eland, and Martin. See if we'll more.
Thank you, Ivan.
Come on
Thank
again.
you, Kelly.
Hopefully, the reception will be better next time. Thank you so much.